gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow. Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald. Dr. Robert M. Price has another question. He says, why do you regard the outer space crucifixion theory as preposterous, since it would be parallel to the pre-mundane heavenly sacrifice of the primal man in Gnosticism and in the Rig Veda?
Bob, I just don't see the connective tissue as clearly as you do. And my specialty is not Gnosticism, although I've published on that topic. And I don't think Gnosticism helps explain Christian origins really at all. So I think what the kind of Gnostic stuff that we find in the New Testament, including Paul, and there's some stuff that looks like that, is mediated through Hellenistic Judaism and a form of Middle Platonism, such as we have in Philo. So I just don't see those connective tissues, and I certainly don't see them in the Q document, and I don't see them really in Paul. So the fact that you have the crucifixion of Jesus and apparently implied in the Q document, and also in Paul as the central, really embarrassing feature of Jesus's career, suggests to me that Jesus was crucified. And if I'm right about the Q document, I can understand why Jews would want to crucify him. Let me tell you, I had a Jewish student in class, a doctoral student, very bright, and he is an Israeli. He actually was raised on a kibbutz. And I love this guy a lot. And he took a course from me on the Gospels, and he told me twice, if I were a Jew living in first century Palestine, I would have wanted to have killed Jesus too. Now, that is not characteristic of all Jews, and we know of progressive rabbis and Jewish scholars who are similarly concerned about the rigid use of Torah in the first century and before that became oppressive. But I want to say something about why it was oppressive earlier on, if I might. Jewish identity was at stake because of the conquest of Israel and that part of the world, first by Alexander the Great, then by his successors, the Diadochi, and then by Rome. And in order to preserve Jewish identity and to win favor from their God, to protect them from their enemies, they pursued rigorous righteousness. And they took, especially the laws of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, very seriously, and tried to impose them on the population so that you would have moral purity and a righteous country. So the social identity of Jews in the first century was wrapped up with fidelity to Jewish law. I call these the Torah enforcers. You have a way of understanding it that's different among Sadducees, but they were Torah enforcers as well. So were the Samaritans. To be Jewish was to be Torah faithful, Torah obedient. It's a part of the covenant. But with all law, there are people who become scofflaws or cannot observe all the commandments. A good example that was an embarrassment and a problem for Jews was, what do soldiers do on the Sabbath if they're attacked? And what about slaves and women and so on that aren't able to observe the Sabbath in the same way? And these are issues in the New Testament, but they're issues inside of Judaism. So Judaism was much more flexible later on in understanding these things. Now, this is not really quite an answer to Bob, but what I would want to say is that Jesus's challenge of Torah enforcers would be sufficient to get him killed. And this is why the reference in Josephus, not to Jesus, but to Jesus's brother James and others, is so important. They lost their lives because of a Jewish judgment that was too rigorously Torah enforceable. And other experts on the law, according to Josephus, said, Ananus, you can't do that anymore, that there needs to be a place for this modified form of Torah observance. That's what it would appear to be. And so I think Jesus's crucifixion is one of the most secure pieces of information we have of first century Palestine at all. And it's not coming out of a heavenly crucifixion with demons and the like.
It is interesting, the approach that not only he, but Dr. Carrier takes. As I was listening to his book yesterday, they mimetically, without getting into any other literature, in Jewish lore, as well as in the Hebrew Bible, they see this death and resurrection of a suffering servant type figure, Isaiah 53. And he goes into like these examples to try and point out like the expectation, and we'll have him here too to interview and ask these differences and stuff. But the expectation that a person would die, a Messiah would die. He makes the case in his book, he's trying to say like, it's not absurd to think that the Messiah would need to die. And so in my mind, right, this is what my rationalization was, already trying to go to bat for both sides in my head. I like to do that, test things out. Was, could these fanatics, and I'm calling them fanatics, they're really thinking they're living in the end. They're really somewhat trying to self-fulfill prophecy. Could it be that this Christ was so devout, and this figure knew he was getting himself into this trouble, but had some kind of eschatological expectation in his own mind that in the process of this is going to wrap the end of days? And I wonder if there was a historical man, Jesus, who's self-fulfilling what's found in Scripture to kind of, in a way, it's not that it's miraculous, but it's like they're reading and expecting these things and interpreting them this way. I wonder.
I think that thinking is totally backwards.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. Most of the texts that are appealed to that way are a part of the mythologizing process to make sense of Jesus's crucifixion. Jesus was a faithful Jew who was wrongly crucified by Romans. How can we make any sense of that in terms of the legacies of Israel? So they scrape around in the New Testament looking, I call it dumpster diving. They're looking for scraps to make sense of Jesus's death. My colleague Greg Riley and I at the School of Theology, we had a common project of collecting all the texts from the Hebrew Bible and Judaism that talked about a suffering Messiah. You know how many we found? Zip. There are none. So Bob and Richard, if you're watching, I would like to see a single text from antiquity that talked about a suffering Messiah. A single one. Now, that's not to say that there aren't texts about the sufferer who gets vindicated. but the titles are not there. So yes, and in fact, you have examples in Homeric epics, of course, of people who wrongly get killed and get a satisfaction afterwards somehow, an exaltation. Take a look at Heracles, for pity's sakes. So Heracles has this miserable death, and it's caused by a wicked centaur, and he's made one of the Olympians. So, but there is not a single text that talks about a suffering Son of Man, that talks about a suffering Messiah. Yes, there are texts about people who suffer and get vindicated. And those were the texts. The suffering servant is an example. Psalm 22 is another example, where Psalm 63, where the early Christians are trying to find biblical justification to make sense theologically of the death of Jesus. But that did not generate the crucifixion. It allowed people to make sense of the crucifixion.
Thank you.